not do in modal logic is this. In the book, oh well, but they don't, I think I have a slightly different example here. Let's see. Something like that, right? Okay. I will never be as happy again as I am now. Let's write this down. Oh, you have it on your handout. Yeah, I don't have to write on the board, right? Okay. I will never be as happy again as I am now. And you know, you have it on page 4, number 4, and translate it into something like, it's not the case that f, I will be as happy as I am now, right? There will be no time later than now at which I am as happy as I am now, right? That's the intended reading of this, and it makes a lot of sense looking at it this way. If you think about the way this is interpreted, though, the sentence, I won't write it up, it's all here on the handout. In 5, is true if and only if there's no t prime such that t is earlier than t prime. And then this sentence, I am as happy as I am now, is true at t prime. Okay, that's what you get if you just follow the recursive clauses of the definition. And now you have to ask yourself, what are the truth conditions of that sentence at t prime? I am as happy as I am now. I claim that this cannot possibly be false. You are always as happy as you are now, right? At any given time t prime, you are as happy as you are at t prime. Now, of course, the sentence meant you are as happy as you are at t, but that variable is gone. We don't have t around anymore. We keep track of t in the meta language when we write these definitions here. There is still a t which we can talk about, but the sentences embedded cannot refer to the original time of evaluation. It can't. The modal operator shifts everything. It creates its own little local context in which you don't know where you came from, as it were. See that? See what I mean? You have no recollection how deeply you are embedded. You don't know that as if you are this embedded sentence. You don't know how many operators there are up there and where you started out from. Now they discuss in the book this one possibility of just putting in a designated time t0 or t star. Often you see that also in linguistics. People, especially with W for worlds, W star for the actual world in the model. So you have this line, and you assume there is t0, and if you have that as a constant in the model, then of course you can refer to it. You can say, yes, now it refers to t0, and then you have, there is no t prime at which I am as happy as at t0. That would work, but then you can no longer use the same model to account for the fact that it is 5 p.m. now is sometimes true and sometimes false, right? If now refers to t0, period, that's what it means. Then at t0 it either is or isn't 5 p.m. And you can't use the same model to say, here it is 5 p.m. now is true, here it's false, and so on. So it's a bit, you see that these, why this is not very satisfactory to have a t star or so. You can use it for single sentences, yes, but not for sentences on different occasions, at different times, and so on. You create a model for one particular speech time, for one occasion of use. And you may not want to do that. You want to have a general model saying, if I say this sentence here, I say something true. If I say it here, I say something false. So, and that, okay, so the first step towards solving that problem is given here on the handout. I know I'm running over time, but I want to, please, I want to finish this, okay? Do you still have tape? Good. Okay. don't want to get lost here. So what they say is that, well, you can express it as I have it on page 6. No, sorry, wait. No. Oh, I don't actually say anything about that. They have, well, so we are actually, the sentence I used had a negation in front of it, right? So if we just use this, it is not the case that I will be, there's a time in which I will be happy as I am. In this language you cannot do that, but here you could say something like, there is no t prime such that t is earlier than t prime, and, well, let me just write it out. V at t prime, what do I have here? I'm sorry, I forgot the dot here. Do you realize that? Do you notice? No. At t prime, let me write it out because I am as happy as I am at t0, t, sorry. Well, so in the book they say t0, okay. That makes sense. You still have this t0 here. How can you get rid of that? Well, you can say that you have a variable here which is bound by something that, well, by its variables, namely an operator. You can say, I'm sort of departing from this a little bit. You have something like this, lambda t. Are you familiar with this lambda notation, with the lambda calculus? Philosophers, too? Have you seen Montague grammar? No? Yeah. But this is not. I'm wondering about this afternoon. There will be lots of these things actually. This means, just quickly, it's a function from times to truth values. This is an argument, and then this will be, if you give it a time, it will give you a truth value. And it's true if and only if both of these things are true. As there is a t prime, there's no t prime of which both of these are true. It's later than now and this sentence, right? And now, if you somehow manage to keep track of your variables, then this t and this t, they remember each other, right? As it were. They can talk about this one can refer back to this. And then the problem of getting the representation to look like this becomes a linguistic problem. Right? Because now what you want to make sure is that as you translate your English sentence into something like this systematically, now there's somewhere embedded there, the word now, whatever it means, has access to this variable by some mechanism of co-reference. Whatever, keep track of it. You have to do. So, but you can at least express this very easily in this language. And you can say that, what's the number of sentences I had? 4 or 5 or something? 4, sentence 4. So you can say that the denotation of this sentence is this function, because this is the characteristic function of the set of times at which it is true. It's like a proposition, where you might say lambda w, and then you say something about w. Here you say lambda t, and you say something about t. It's true for all those world set times where this is true. This being here, the whole thing. So this is a more powerful language that you actually need for many purposes, especially words like now and actually in the modal domain. Actually is just like now in this behavior like that. And also words like tomorrow, today, yesterday, in English, in most languages, including Japanese. These are always interpreted from the perspective of speech time, even if they are deeply embedded. Tomorrow always means tomorrow. It doesn't mean, when you have something like, now to use a conditional, if he comes tomorrow, I will reserve his hotel room. Okay. Compare this to if he comes the following day, I will reserve his hotel room. You see the difference there. If he comes the following day, that might be something like, if next week, when he contacts me, I learn that he comes, if there is a time in the future, t prime, such that he comes one day after t prime, then I'll reserve his hotel room. Right? It can mean that. But tomorrow, if he comes tomorrow, cannot have that meaning, right? If there is a time t prime such that he comes one day after t prime, that's not what it means. It's one day after now. Do you see that difference? So for these indexical adverbs like tomorrow, yesterday, and so on, and now, and actually, in fact, these things in the modal domain, you want to be able to access the outermost context of evaluation. I'm sorry. Let's have 15 minutes now, and come back at 11:30. Okay. And time, because that's the whole point of today's topic, modality and time. And on the handout here, page 7, there are a few example sentences which motivate this need for dealing with modality in connection with time. The problem is that you can't really, ultimately we will see that you cannot really have one theory of time, one theory of modality, and then you just put them together and you have an account of how they interact. It's not that simple. You need to really have to have one in mind as you develop the other. But currently here, the first one of this handout is just something against this simplistic view of time as a line that goes from the past into the future, like this. So here, counterfactual conditionals again. Okay, there is. So let's look at this example 10. It's a famous one. If Oswald had not killed Kennedy, someone else would have. And let's just assume that Oswald did kill Kennedy, okay? I think that's pretty generally assumed. So this sentence is false. 10a is false now. And now let's look at 10b. If Oswald does not kill Kennedy, someone else will. Well, that presumably was false at the time in question, right? On November 21st, 1963, one day before the assassination, the sentence, if Oswald does not kill Kennedy, someone else will, was false. Presumably, well, we actually, perhaps you couldn't know that at the time, but now we know that it was false. And this sentence, B and A, they go together in some way, right? A is false because B is false. That is a view that lots of people share about counterfactuals, namely that there are basically just past tense forms of these predictive conditionals. Now I don't actually, I know that this is the wrong view, and there are lots of problems in detail, many counterexamples to it, but for purposes of this discussion, let's just assume that it is the case that counterfactuals go with past predictive indicatives in this way. And then, you have this sentence 10c, which says, if Oswald did not kill Kennedy, someone else did. And that is true, right, at present, because Kennedy is dead. Not only is he dead, he was shot dead. Someone killed him. So if it wasn't Oswald, it has to have been someone else. All right, so 10c then is not equivalent to these other ones. And, well, remember what we said before. We said that conditionals are these quantifiers over possible worlds, right? They say that all possible worlds of a certain kind that have, in which the antecedent is true, the consequent must also be true. So if that's the case, and here too, perhaps you're talking about different possible worlds. There's a modal element in there which explains, perhaps, why they come out different. The idea is that now we know that Kennedy is dead, but on the day before the assassination, that was not so clear that he would be shot, right? Was not yet determined. So if we can say that 10c is interpreted from our present perspective, and here now, right? I actually call this thing now. Soon, of course, there is such a time. We think about these past events in one way, but at the time in question, on the day before the assassination, the conditional, the very same conditional, looked different. It had a different value. Now, unless the meaning of the conditional itself changes, there must be a difference in the modal base with regard to which it is evaluated, right? The kinds of alternatives that you consider are different now. In all of them, Kennedy is dead. At the time, that was not the case. There were, at the time, possible futures in which Kennedy would survive. That's why we think that the conditional was false. It was not so clear that someone else would shoot him, right? You see that? You see what I mean? So at the time, there were possible worlds relevant to the truth value of the conditional that are no longer relevant from our perspective. Something has gone away. So in the past, there were alternative futures somewhere in here, right? Here he was shot, whatever. So actually here he is killed at this point. Before there were alternative futures, but now there are no longer alternative pasts. There were more futures in the past than there are now pasts, right? Possible alternative pasts. So somehow the modal base, now, okay, how do we actually put these things together? This is time, right? But this is also one particular course of events. At each point in here, we have a complete specification of all truth values of atomic sentences, right? Totally determined. So each of these looks like a world, and this whole thing is also like a single world. Okay. Before we were drawing worlds like this, and there were points, timeless, no structure, no internal structure. Now imagine that you pull this out of the board and lay it on the side like this. That's what they look like. You only see points, but if you look at them from the side, you see lines. So each of these corresponds actually to one of these possible worlds. So time, let me write the direction of time somewhere else, because we can call these things W and W prime and so on. And time is down, this is how they are synchronized, how they are aligned. Now we have W here, our world, say, where we evaluate the conditional. And what we just said about there being more futures in the past than there are now pasts left just means that the modal base was this big back then, and it is this big now. Modal base being a set of alternative worlds, right? And so on. So we can draw all these things. See what I mean, how this is supposed to work. And it's a bit like, you know, at that time you had this whole set of alternatives. This is at time t. And then at now you have only a few left. This is t, this is now. The modal base has become smaller. Because all these facts have accumulated, among them the fact that Kennedy was killed. In the big one, there were worlds where Kennedy survives, right? Or where there is no assassination, where whatever, you know, there's Oswald is arrested and there is no backup, whatever, he misses, something like that. Now we know Kennedy is dead, he was killed. So we have fewer open possibilities than were back then. And only in this way can we account for the difference in truth value between these conditionals. That's the best thing to say about that, right? Back then, there were more open possibilities than there are now. Okay? And time proceeds in this way from the past into the future by eliminating possible continuations. That much is clear, right? Is it clear? Yeah. And I think we all share intuitions about that. That is the case. So we don't. In the past, things could have been different, but now they can no longer be different from what they actually were. You might have gone to Todai. That's true, but you may have gone to Todai is not true. It's no longer possible that you went to Todai, right, as a student. You're in Kyodai now. In the past, it could have been different. I should have used it. I'm sorry. Never mind. It's a good thing to be here and not in Todai. Sorry. They don't hear these lectures. Okay. Let's buy the DVD. Yeah. Okay, so as time goes on, things become smaller. Now this is the modal base, whatever that is, it can again be epistemic or circumstantial, whatever. Goes like it shrinks. That's how time moves on. The second thing I would like to discuss is now, what kind of modal base are we talking about? Let's just say that these conditionals are evaluated with regard to an epistemic model in the linguistic sense, right? As we said yesterday, there is this epistemic wide scope model in all conditionals, and they all quantify universally over the worlds in that modal base. But the linguistically epistemic models, there was a terminological confusion, right? They can have different readings. They can be speakers' beliefs, speakers' knowledge states, and also these so-called circumstantial things, right? Linguistically, they occupy this position, they play that role. Okay, so which one are we talking about here with these two sentences? Well, to look at these other conditionals in 11 now on page 8, this is now, I have to say, it's a somewhat intricate argument. It's a bit difficult. I hope we can get through this easily. Look, first of all, at the sentences in 11. if this piece of granite is placed in water, it will dissolve. This is again looking from some temporal perspective into the future, right? And compare this to if this piece of sugar is placed in water, it will dissolve. And I think we all agree that there is a correct and objectively correct opinion that you should have about these things if you know physics. Because A is false and B is true. Everyone agrees on that. That's very clear. And if someone uses the sentence A, then we know, this is false. We would reject this. No, you're wrong. Look at the facts. The facts are such that A is false. So we have to distinguish two readings here. Certainly someone can assert this sentence relative to his or her beliefs, right? Someone can falsely believe sentence A, and it has this epistemic reading. It is then true of this belief state, but we also know it is actually false at the actual world. So there is an objective notion of some kind of objective modal base, something that is independent of what these people believe about it, right? Now, if the conditional is evaluated in the same way in both cases, then the objective modal base, the modal base is also a collection of possible continuations of history. But it may be different, right? We may have wrong opinions about it. So we have to distinguish subjective beliefs and objective possibilities. This is the same as the distinction between subjective probability and objective chance, if you're familiar with that. And in these cases, we have intuitions about the connection between them. So, there's a right thing to believe. If you now look at 12, suppose this piece of material, granite or sugar, was not placed into water. Okay? And now ask yourself, what is the truth value of this sentence? If this piece of granite was placed in water, it dissolved. This is not a counterfactual. This is supposed to be a typical indicative conditional. And I trust that you share this judgment. Tell me if you don't. I'm not sure if there may be differences because you speak Japanese and I don't, or I speak English, but whatever. But I think it's easy to agree that both 12a and 12b sound somewhat odd. At least we would not be able to say whether they are in fact true or false. Do you agree? Is there an objectively correct belief to have? If this piece of granite was placed into water, it dissolved. How would you tell whether that is true or false? You can't, because it wasn't placed in water. Right? Still, however, someone who doesn't know whether it was placed in water or not can, of course, still use this sentence relative to his or her own beliefs. His or her own beliefs, right? You can still say this, but you cannot if you know that the water, the material was not placed in water. And as long as you don't know that, the conditional makes sense. But now, even though you can say it, we can no longer tell whether it's true or false, whether you are right or wrong. You just don't know, you don't have all the information. That's what I learned from your conditional, right? So this connection between this objective reading and the subjective reading after the fact goes away, breaks. You can't really say that there is an objective truth of the matter. And that's another argument that we have to distinguish those two things. How can we actually account for the oddness of the A sentence after the fact? Where we can say, a bit like here, in the case of Kennedy, we can say the facts are such that the material was not placed into water. So this objective modal base of possible continuations of the past is now such that all the worlds are non-water, non-antecedent worlds, right? And then the conditional quantifies over an empty domain, and in linguistics that's a bad thing. It leads to presupposition failure, lack of a truth value. Some story like that is what people say about this, right? And so it's a strange thing. We don't know whether it's true or false. Okay, but the epistemic one is still either true or false because that depends on the epistemic modal base. If that is so, then the epistemic modal base must be bigger than the objective one, right? Because the speaker who says the sentence does not know whether the antecedent is true or false. So there are antecedent pasts in which it was placed in water, and non-antecedent pasts in which it was not placed into water. So different domains of quantification. And we have to keep these two readings distinct, the subjective one with regard to someone's epistemic state, and the objective one with regard to some kind of objective collection of possible histories. I hope you followed this argument. This is a pretty philosophical thing to say, so you may find it easy, but we can talk about it again afterwards. But let's just go with this conclusion for now. So I want to eventually deal with both of these modal bases and their interaction with time. They both shrink, but in different ways. There is no objective uncertainty about the past. But there can be subjective uncertainty about the past. Right. Now here, the English present tense. Now I'm moving on to page 9. You can read through all these things here in between. This is basically what I just said. It's just so you can, afterwards, you can get back and say what it was. Look up what it was. The English present tense is a bit strange. This will show up in this paper that we are talking about this afternoon. And Japanese is a bit similar, but not the same. Not exactly. Have some differences. If you look at the sentences in 13, Megan was in her office yesterday. Megan is in her office now and is in her office tomorrow. They are all well-formed sentences of English. You can use them perfectly fine. However, 13c is a bit special. You're probably taught that you shouldn't say that in English. I don't know. You don't say that, right, in English. You would say Megan will be in her office tomorrow. But that is not required. The sentence makes sense. Makes perfect sense. But it comes with a special connotation. Something to the effect that Megan's being in her office is not just true, but somehow determined, predetermined, inevitable, scheduled, or something like that. And that's why this sounds a bit weird, but you can say things like the sun rises at 5:30 tomorrow. That's perfectly fine, because that is in fact determined by the movements of the celestial bodies, right? So people have wondered about the status of this additional condition that comes in here in C, this necessity flavor, right? More is required than just truth. It's necessity. Is that part of the tense? If it is, then we have 3 tenses in English: past, present, and this future, the that looks like the present, but brings with it this additional condition, right? Steedman, for instance, says precisely that. Dowdy said that too. Various linguists have put this necessity condition into the semantics or pragmatic, somehow into their account of the present tense, but only when you talk about the future. Now, it's a bit strange to do this because if you turn the page to 14, example 14, Megan came to her office yesterday. Megan comes to her office now and comes to her office tomorrow. Okay. There is no difference between the A sentences and the C sentences. You still see the same contrast. C somehow requires it makes a stronger assertion intuitively, right, than A. But B in 13 is also strange in exactly the same way. In English, you can say 13b without this necessity flavor. They say you can say right, but you cannot say 14b without that. What is the difference between them? Well, in 14 you have a different predicate. It comes to your office. That is a different aspectual class. And it's not a stative. You have a stative verb in 13, and that may be all the difference because stative verbs can the reference time can coincide with the evaluation time. It usually does. Whereas with these others, activities, accomplishments, so on, it doesn't. It has to be in the future. And this in fact means she comes to her office, not really now, but soon. Same in Japanese with ima, right? Ima office ni imasu, ima office ni ikimasu or kimasu. Refers to different times. So the difference between them is that, well, let's see, between all the 6 sentences now in 13 and 14, difference is there that it's summarized on the handout. That's why I'm not writing it. Tell me if I should keep track of it on the board. So in 13a and b, and in 14a, the reference time that the sentence is talking about is no later than the speech time, right? Earlier or simultaneous. In 13c and in 14b and c, it is later. Reference time is later than the speech time. And that's a fact that is independent, perhaps. Well, not independent, but it's not the same as saying that you have this necessity reading. There's a different fact about these sentences, but you have this necessity thing if and only if the reference time is later than the speech time. That's an interesting observation, right? So do they have anything in common? Are they, is one causing the other? That's the question. And if you can say that one follows from the other, then you can stay with the idea that English only has 2 tenses, past and non-past. The question is, does English have 3 tenses, right? Is there actually this semantic difference between the present tense, what looks like present, in 13b and 13c, but not 14b and 14c? Or does this follow from something? Difference between them. If it follows from something else, then you can say the tense is the same. The tense is just non-past. In all 4 B, C sentences, the tense is non-past. And then you get this certainty condition, this necessity. Whenever it is not only non-past, but actually future. So the tense, present tense would be something like this, right? No earlier. That's its general meaning. But if it is in fact strictly earlier, then you get this necessity thing. Right? When you're talking about something that actually lies in the future. And you never get this necessity connotation with the past. Never with past reference. Only when the reference time follows the speech time. So there is this little mismatch here in these three sentences. Let's see, in 13a, let me actually write it like this. You have the speech time somewhere here. That's one way of, a simple way of writing these things. You have the speech time, and in 13a, you have past and plus necessity, say. Sorry, minus. You don't have this necessity, right? In 14, also you have past tense and no necessity element, semantic element. We will talk later about whether this is an implicature or an entailment or something, if we get to it. I'm saying later, even though we have only 15 minutes left, because part of the paper that we'll be talking about is about this. If you've read it, you saw this issue coming up there. Then in 13, we had present with co-reference time here, present, in fact, referring to this very thing, right? This very time of evaluation. Perhaps I should say that too here. Let's see. The reference time is earlier than the speech time in both of these. Here you have present with the reference time equal to speech time, no necessity or scheduling or planning or inevitability conveyed. Right. In 14 you have present. You do have the necessity, and you do have S before R, right? Speech time before the reference time. So it actually it goes sort of actually refers to something in the near future, necessarily because of the aspectual class of the verb. And then for the C sentences, present, you get this S earlier than R, and you get this present S earlier than R. Okay, now how do we predict whether we get this necessity thing or not? Well, it sometimes comes up with the present and sometimes doesn't. That's not the best predictor. Well, but you do get it whenever this is the case, right? Now the mismatch, I spoke of a mismatch because if we say that the present is non-past, then the present, from the perspective of this time here, the speech time, is all of these things, right? Most importantly, the speech time is included, right? It's non-past, and past is everything that is strictly earlier. Okay, so the present refers to everything that is either equal to or later than the speech time. Because you can use it with these datives here, obviously, right? It has to be like this. The past refers to everything that is strictly earlier. The necessity condition there arises with everything that is strictly later, right? And it does not arise with everything that is earlier or co-temporal. So would it not make sense to say that this necessity thing, whatever it is, whether you see it or not, really depends on this and not this, right? This but not this. That seems to make sense. Okay, can we find an explanation why it should be like this? Why should it be that you see it with this but not with this, right? With times following really truly strictly in the future, but not with others. Yes, there is an explanation for that, because, well, it goes along with all these intuitions about the past being fixed and the future being open, right? The facts of the past have accumulated and can no longer be changed. They cannot be different from what they actually are, have been. Whereas for the future you have various open possibilities. So what I say in this paper, I'm saying this already now because this gives us a bit more time in the afternoon. What I say there is that, again, you have something like this. Some word like this, and now you're asking, is a sentence like Megan is in her office true or false, or what does it convey? And somehow, by some mechanism, either semantic or pragmatic, I have an opinion on that, but people disagree. Somehow, if this is the modal base at the speech time, the sentence, she is in her office, always asserts she is in her office at all of these alternatives. Now, the sentence, she was in her office, also asserts that she was in her office at all these alternatives. So if you uniformly include a necessity model into the semantics of all the tenses, you just say, Megan tense be in her office, where tense can be past or present, and Megan tense come to her office, where tense can be past or present. All of these have an universal quantification over these historical alternatives here. And this falls out. You have explained this already, right? Because all these things, they share the same past. If she indeed came to her office in the past, then she did so in all of them. Truth here coincides with necessity over this whole set. It's true at W if and only if it's true at all of these. Right? Likewise, at the present time, now has that property too, because facts are accumulating as we speak, and once they have manifested themselves, they can no longer be otherwise. And this circle should be the same size circle. But these historical alternatives, they differ in the future. There is uncertainty about the future, but not about the past. Now, whenever you shift the reference time into this territory, the claim that the claim that the sentence is true is weaker than the claim that it is necessarily true for all of these things. Right? Now, there, truth and this necessity become different. Over here, up to here, they always coincide. Here, they become different. And suddenly, this necessity condition, which is always there, becomes felt as an additional claim, right? And adding strength to the assertion. But there's no generality is lost if we say that it is always there, because up to here, truth and that necessity coincide. Okay, that's a story that I tell in a paper about the present tense, and the argument for having a necessity modal in there and in the past tense doesn't hurt in the past, but it explains this split. You have this here and absent here. And this necessity here with regard to these historical alternatives is called settledness. It's settled. You saw this in the Thomason paper. He once mentioned that word. It since has become a big thing in the literature. And we'll be saying more about that in the afternoon. Okay. So far, so good. We still have 5 minutes, so we're not done. Okay. Do you have any questions about this? Any objections, or I don't know? Now, in Japanese, I mean, it's a bit the same, but you can actually use the present to refer to the future, and you don't get quite as strong an assertion. After office ni ikimasu is not as bad, or not. You can use that in more situations than you could say in English. I go to the office tomorrow. You can say it in English, but it's very marked as a reading that is rarely true, as it were. So in English you have a stronger universal quantification. Perhaps you can account for this in terms of this simple necessity versus human necessity, or something like that. As in Japanese, you can use these more easily. Behind all of this is also the question of the thing is, why can't you just assert this and people won't notice? Right? Why does it sound odd? It may be false, but why does it sound odd if someone says it? Normally, if someone makes a false assertion, people don't see that, right? You don't actually, assertion doesn't come marked as false. You can lie. Here, this has again to do with the relation between epistemic states and these objective historical alternatives. Because if you assert such a thing, Megan comes to your office tomorrow, you claim that you are in a position to say that, right? You know that, you have the information. Now, I said once before, you may not remember that, I said these subjective modal bases must always be supersets, or they must be, they cannot be smaller than these objective ones. I said that in connection with the granite that was placed in water, right? People can still use the conditional epistemically if they don't know that the antecedent is false. Now, what does it mean? If they haven't ruled out that case. If their epistemic model base is bigger, contains more worlds of a different kind than the objective one. And there's a general constraint on what can possibly be known. So this will also come up again in the paper. This is sort of preview now. If this is the set of all objectively open possibilities, if you know, the idea is that if you know all the past and present facts, then the only uncertainty, the only lack of information that remains is about the future, right? So you know all these past facts, but you still don't know what will happen. Not necessarily, unless it's a statement about the stars, some deterministic process, right? So you can make these, people won't notice if you lie about the past in this way by saying she was in her office. People will easily think that you may be in a position to say that. But people will notice if you say she is in her office tomorrow, because you could not possibly know that for sure. So there's this constraint that will come back. If we deal with these two modalities, this objective and subjective uncertainty, you can never, if in fact these events have not yet come to pass, if they are still not settled, then you cannot already know them. And formally this means that your epistemic model base may not cut across this. So basically it cannot be something like this, right? That's out. Because having fewer worlds means knowing more. And these worlds only differ with regard to the future. So having fewer worlds means knowing something about the future. Do you follow? So we'll say it again after the lunch break. So epistemic states must be equivalence classes, as unions of equivalence classes of these historical alternatives. So there are, of course, the past could have been different. So even though now these things are determined and settled, right? There are alternative classes of these pasts, right? And your epistemic state cannot cut across those dividing lines between them. It must be a union of these equivalence classes. So you can have, if you know P, not P, right? If you know P, then you have already ruled out this case. If you don't know P, then you haven't ruled it out. Okay? But it's not possible for you to have ruled out this much, because that means knowing something about what will happen in the future. I can say all of this again if you want to go through it again. This explains a lot. This is pretty good. And I didn't invent this. I'd like to stop now, so we have our lunch break, and then we'll be back at 2, and I'll see you then. We are almost ready to start this other hand.